I once believed that the more I owned, the more control I had over my life. But there were strange days when I stood in a room full of everything and still felt like something was missing, something I could not name. A man in Japan once walked into his apartment with 10,000 possessions, and 3 days later he walked out with only 37. Not because he lost his mind, but because for the first time he saw clearly what truly mattered. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that our life is wasted on things that are not necessary. And maybe we are not tired because of life itself, but because we are carrying too much. And if that is true, how many things in your life are truly serving you? And how many are quietly taking control of you? Tishi had what most people would call a good life, a stable career, a respectable income, a well-furnished apartment in Tokyo, and everything that was supposed to signal that he was doing well. And for a long time, he believed it too, because that is what everyone around him seemed to believe, that success could be measured by accumulation, by how much you could afford, by how many choices you had, by how full your life looked from the outside. But there was a quiet contradiction that kept growing inside him, something that did not match the image he had built, something that did not go away, no matter how much he added. Every morning he would stand in front of his closet, staring at dozens of options. And instead of feeling prepared, he felt exhausted. Not because choosing was difficult, but because choosing never ended. Every decision felt small, but together they drained him. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. And every night he would scroll through shopping apps, telling himself he deserved something new, something better, something that would finally make things feel complete. But the satisfaction never lasted. It dissolved almost immediately, leaving behind the same emptiness that pushed him to buy in the first place. He did not question it, because no one around him questioned it. This was normal. This was modern life. Until one moment broke the illusion. He walked into a department store to buy something simple, just a black t-shirt. Nothing complicated, nothing special. But when he stood in front of the display, he was faced with over 100 nearly identical options, and something inside him stopped working. His mind could not process it, not because the choice was important, but because it was one choice too many. His chest tightened. His breathing became shallow. And before he understood what was happening, he found himself sitting on the floor, unable to move, surrounded by things that were supposed to make life easier, but instead had made it unbearable. Later, the explanation was simple: decision fatigue. Too many choices, too much input, not enough clarity. But the diagnosis did not capture what he felt, because it was not just about that moment. It was about everything leading up to it. All the small decisions, all the unnecessary complexity, all the silent pressure of maintaining a life built on excess. That night, he returned home, not with a new purchase, but with a question he could no longer ignore. And for the first time in years, he looked around his apartment, not with pride, but with doubt. Every surface was filled, every drawer was packed, every corner held something he once believed he needed. And yet none of it made him feel at ease. If anything, it made the space feel smaller, heavier, almost suffocating. It was as if the more he added, the less room he had to exist. And in that moment, something shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to anyone else, but internally, quietly. He began to see the connection, that his external environment was not separate from his internal state, that the chaos around him was not random. It was a reflection, a physical manifestation of a mind that had been overloaded for years. And then he remembered the box. the one he had avoided opening since his mother passed away. 3 years, sitting untouched. Not because he forgot, but because he was afraid of what it might bring back. But now, standing in the middle of everything he owned, he felt something different. Not fear, but necessity. He opened it slowly, as if time itself had slowed down. And inside there was no object of value, no inheritance, no solution. Just a single piece of paper with a sentence written in her handwriting. Simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. Simplify your life before life simplifies you. And for a long time he just stood there, holding those words, because he understood something he had missed before, that his life had not become complicated by accident. It had become complicated because he kept adding without questioning, because he kept filling every empty space, because he believed that more would eventually become enough. And now, for the first time, he saw the possibility that it never would, that no amount of accumulation could solve a problem that was never about lack. And that realization did not feel comfortable. It felt unsettling, because it meant that everything he had been doing might have been pointing in the wrong direction. And yet, beneath that discomfort, there was something else, something quieter, something closer to relief. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the way forward was not to add more, but to begin letting go. The next morning, Tishi did not start by throwing anything away. He did something far more uncomfortable. He started looking, really looking, not at his life as he wanted it to be, but at what was actually there. And for the first time, he stopped seeing his possessions as neutral objects. He began to see them as weight, as demands, as silent obligations that followed him from room to room. A shirt was no longer just a shirt. It was a decision waiting to be made. A book was no longer just knowledge. It was a reminder of something unfinished, something he told himself he should become, something he had not lived up to yet. And the more he observed, the more unsettling it became, because nothing around him was passive. Everything required a small piece of his attention, his energy, his clarity. And individually, each piece seemed harmless. But together, they formed something heavy, something constant, something he had been carrying without ever noticing. He sat in the middle of his apartment and closed his eyes. And instead of adding anything, he imagined removing everything, not physically, but mentally, stripping the space down to nothing. No furniture, no shelves, no objects, just empty space. And then he asked himself a question that felt simple but was not easy to answer. If I had nothing, what would I bring back? Slowly, one, he began to add things back into that empty space in his mind. Only the things that truly served his life, as it was, not the life he imagined, not the life he performed, but the life he actually lived. And what surprised him was not what remained, but how little remained, because so much of what he owned had nothing to do with who he was in the present moment. It belonged to a past version of himself he was no longer living, or a future version of himself he might never become. And for the first time, he saw clearly that his possessions were not supporting his life. They were fragmenting it, pulling his attention in different directions, keeping him tied to identities that no longer fit. And he remembered a thought he once read from Marcus Aurelius, that if you remove your unnecessary thoughts, you remove your unnecessary suffering. And he realized that thoughts and objects were not separate, because the objects around him were generating the thoughts inside him. Every item was a signal, a reminder, a decision, a story. And his mind was responding to all of them, whether he wanted to or not. And suddenly the idea of simplicity no longer felt like deprivation. It felt like clarity, like the possibility of finally having a mind that was not constantly interrupted, not constantly pulled away from itself. He looked around again, and instead of seeing abundance, he saw noise. Not loud noise, et but constant noise, the kind that does not let you rest, the kind that fills every moment with subtle pressure. And he understood something that changed the way he saw everything. He did not own 10,000 things. He was managing 10,000 responsibilities, 10,000 open loops that never fully closed. And no matter how organized he tried to be, no system could remove the fact that each item required something from him. Attention, carré, space, memory. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he had built a life where his energy was scattered across objects instead of directed toward living. And this was the principle of Kanso. Not the act of throwing things away, but the discipline of returning to what is essential, the refusal to carry what does not serve, the understanding that every unnecessary thing is not harmless. It is a form of friction, a quiet resistance against clarity. And in that moment, Tishi did not feel the urge to clean. He felt the urge to understand, because the problem was not the objects themselves. It was the reason he had allowed them to accumulate, the belief that more would give him control, that more would make him feel secure, that more would fill what felt empty inside. But now he could see that it had done the opposite. It had multiplied his decisions, diluted his focus, and slowly taken away the space he needed to think, to breathe, to simply be. And for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone. He did not open an app. He did not look for something to add. He sat there in the quiet weight of realization, understanding that the path forward was not about organizing what he had, but about questioning why he needed so much in the first place. At first, Tishi believed that once he saw clearly what was unnecessary, he would feel lighter. He expected relief, a sense of freedom, something immediate and obvious. But what came instead was something he was not prepared for. Silence. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels heavy, unfamiliar, almost threatening, because for the first time in years, there was nothing between him and himself. No distractions, no small decisions to hide behind, no constant movement to keep him from stopping. And in that stillness, something began to surface. Slowly at first, then all at once, thoughts he had postponed, feelings he had buried, questions he had avoided. It was not the absence of noise that disturbed him. It was what the absence revealed. He realized that the objects he had surrounded himself with had never been the source of comfort. They had been a barrier, a way to keep distance from something deeper, something unresolved. And now that barrier was gone, even if only in his mind. And what remained was not clarity, but confrontation. He sat there, resisting the urge to reach for anything, to fill the space again, to return to what was familiar. And that urge was stronger than he expected, not because he needed something, but because he did not want to feel what was emerging. And this is where most people turn back, not because simplicity is difficult, but because stillness is unbearable when you are not used to it. Because stillness does not give you anything. It shows you everything. Tishi began to understand that his habits were not random. They were patterns of avoidance. Every purchase, every scroll, every moment of distraction had been a way of stepping away from himself. Not intentionally, not consciously, but consistently. And now, without those layers, he felt exposed. He felt the weight of things he had not allowed himself to process. Grief that had been pushed aside, regret that had never been acknowledged, a quiet sense of emptiness that had been there long before the possessions. And for a moment, He questioned whether he had made a mistake, whether it would have been easier to continue as he was, to keep the noise, to keep the movement, to keep the illusion of control. But something in him chose to stay, not because it was comfortable, but because it was honest. He remembered something he had once read from Marcus Aurelius, that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And he began to see that what he was feeling was not caused by the absence of objects. It was caused by the presence of something he had been avoiding. And that realization changed the way he approached the moment. He stopped trying to escape it. He stopped labeling it as something wrong. Instead, he sat with it, not trying to fix it, not trying to understand it completely, just allowing it to exist without interference. And as time passed, something subtle began to shift. The intensity did not disappear, but it softened. The resistance lessened. The need to run faded slightly. And in its place, there was a different kind of awareness. A recognition that what he had been running from was not something that would destroy him. It was something that needed to be seen. And this was the principle of Seijaku, not silence as an absence, but stillness as a presence, the discipline of not reacting, to the willingness to remain with what is uncomfortable without immediately trying to change it. And Tishi realized that without this step, simplicity would remain superficial, because removing objects without facing what they were hiding would only create a new form of avoidance, a cleaner version of the same pattern. And so he stayed, hour after hour, not in pursuit of peace, but in acceptance of what was there. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the chaos inside him began to organize itself, not because he controlled it, but because he finally stopped interfering with it. And in that quiet shift, he understood something that had been hidden for years, that the things he had been trying to escape were not the problem. The constant effort to escape them was, after sitting with that stillness long enough, Tishi began to notice something he had never paid attention to before: the role of space. Not the objects within it, but the absence between them. Because for most of his life, he had treated emptiness as something to avoid, something to fill as quickly as possible. A blank wall needed decoration. A quiet moment needed sound. An open hour needed a task. And without realizing it, he had trained himself to fear anything that was not occupied. But now, in the quiet aftermath of his own stillness, he began to see that the problem was not that his life lacked something, it was that it had no room left for anything meaningful to exist. Every surface in his apartment had been covered, every shelf filled, every corner assigned a function, and what he once called efficiency now revealed itself as suffocation, because nothing could move, nothing could breathe, and more importantly, he could not breathe within it. He thought about how he had structured his time in the same way, his calendar packed from morning to night, every hour accounted for, every gap treated as wasted time. And yet, despite all that structure, he never felt truly productive, only tired, as if he was constantly moving without ever arriving anywhere. And in that realization, something simple but unsettling became clear: that emptiness was not the enemy. It was the condition that allowed everything else to function. Without empty space, a room becomes unusable. Without pauses, music becomes noise. Without silence, thought becomes impossible. And yet he had spent years eliminating every form of emptiness from his life, believing that fullness meant progress, that more activity meant more value, that constant stimulation meant he was engaged with life. But now he could see that it had done the opposite. It had disconnected him from it. Because when there is no space, there is no awareness, only reaction. And this was the principle of Ma, Not emptiness as lack, but emptiness as presence, as a deliberate creation of space where life can actually unfold. And for the first time, Tishi did not try to add anything. He did the opposite. He chose one small area of his life and removed everything from it. Not permanently, not dramatically, just enough to experience what remained when nothing was there. He cleared a table, left it empty, and sat in front of it. At first it felt uncomfortable, unnecessary even. His mind searched for something to place there, something to justify the space, but he resisted, and as minutes passed, the discomfort began to shift, not disappear, but change its form. What once felt like emptiness started to feel like openness, a kind of quiet expansion that he had not experienced in years. And in that simple act, he understood something that no amount of accumulation had ever given him, that space itself has value, not because of what you can put into it, but because of what it allows you to perceive. He began applying this not only to his environment, but to his time and his attention, leaving parts of his day unscheduled, walking without headphones, allowing conversations to have pauses instead of filling every silence. And slowly, something returned to him. Clarity, not forced, not constructed, but emerging naturally when there was finally room for it. And he remembered a reflection from Marcus Aurelius, that nowhere can a person find a more peaceful retreat than within their own mind. And he realized that his mind had not been unavailable. It had been overcrowded, filled to the point where there was no place left to retreat to. And now, by creating space externally, he was rediscovering that internal space as well. And this changed the way he understood control, because real control was not about managing more, it was about needing less, about allowing enough emptiness for what truly matters to appear without being forced. And for the first time, the absence he once feared began to feel like something he could trust. As the space around him became clearer, something more difficult began to take shape within him. A question that could no longer be avoided. If so much of what he owned was unnecessary, then who exactly had he been living for? Because when the noise fades and the distractions lose their grip, what remains is not just silence, but identity. And Tishi realized that for years he had not been living as himself. He had been performing a version of himself that made sense to the world around him. A version that looked successful, competent, impressive. A version built piece by piece through the things he chose to own. The clothes that signaled status, the books that suggested ambition, the devices that implied productivity. But now, sitting in a room that no longer overwhelmed him, he began to see that most of these choices had not come from clarity. They had come from expectation, from the quiet pressure to become someone recognizable, someone approved, someone aligned with what success was supposed to look like. And the realization was not immediate relief. It was discomfort, because it meant that much of what he had built was not false, but it was not fully true either. It was a compromise between who he was and who he believed he needed to be. And in that gap, he had slowly lost sight of what felt natural to him. Not what looked right, but what actually fit. He began asking himself questions he had never taken seriously before, not about goals or achievements, but about simplicity. What do I reach for when no one is watching? What feels calm without needing to be justified? What do I return to when I am not trying to become anything else? And the answers were almost surprisingly quiet. Not grand, not impressive, but honest. He found that he preferred simple tea over elaborate routines, that he felt more at ease in comfortable clothes than in anything that required attention. that he was drawn to writing and reflection rather than constant activity. And none of these things required the life he had built. None of them required the accumulation he had justified for so long. And this is where the principle of Shizen revealed itself, not as a rule, but as a return to what is natural, what exists without force, without performance, without the need to maintain an image. And Tishi saw clearly that much of his suffering had not come from having too little, but from maintaining too much that did not belong to him. Objects that represented a future he had not chosen, a past he had not released, and an identity that was never fully his. And in that understanding, letting go was no longer about discipline. It became about honesty, because every item he kept now had to answer a simple question. Does this serve who I actually am, or who I am trying to appear as? And the difference between those two was everything, because one required effort, maintenance, and constant reinforcement, while the other required almost nothing. It simply was. And he remembered a line from Marcus Aurelius, that a person should stand upright, not be kept upright. And for the first time, that idea felt tangible, because he could see how much of his life had been spent propping up an image that needed constant support, constant validation, constant évidence. And without it, he felt unstable, uncertain, incomplete. But now, as he began to align his environment with what felt natural rather than what looked right, that instability began to fade. Not because he had found a better version of himself, but because he had stopped resisting the one that was already there. And in that shift, simplicity took on a new meaning. It was no longer about having less. It was about removing what was not aligned, about stripping away what was unnecessary until what remained did not need to be explained. And this process was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible, but it was consistent. And with each choice, each object released, each expectation questioned, Tishi moved closer to something he had not felt in years. Not excitement, not achievement, but a steady, grounded sense of being at ease in his own life. And that, more than anything he had accumulated before, was enough. The transformation did not happen the way most people imagine. There was no sudden breakthrough, no dramatic moment where everything became perfect. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like a shift in weight that you only recognize after you stop carrying it. Tishi did not wake up one morning as a different person. He simply stopped reinforcing the version of himself that required constant effort to maintain. And as that pressure faded, his life began to rearrange itself in ways that felt natural rather than forced. He started with his environment, not by aggressively removing everything, but by allowing only what was essential to remain. And over time, the number reduced itself, not because he was trying to reach a specific number, but because there was less and less that truly belonged, until eventually what remained was simple, functional, and aligned with how he actually lived. A small set of clothes that he wore without hesitation, a few objects that served clear purposes, and a space that no longer demanded his attention every time he entered it. And what surprised him most was not what he had removed, but what he had gained, because in the absence of excess, something else became visible. Time, energy, clarity, things that had always been there, but had been buried under layers of unnecessary complexity. His mornings changed first. What once took 45 minutes now took 5, not because he rushed, but because there was nothing left to overthink. His decisions became fewer but more deliberate. His attention no longer fragmented across countless small choices. And that alone created a sense of calm he had not experienced in years. His work began to change as well, not in its external form, but in how he approached it, without the constant background noise of unresolved decisions and accumulated clutter. He found it easier to focus, to complete tasks without interruption, to think clearly without being pulled in different directions. And gradually he realized that productivity was not about doing more. It was about removing what prevented him from doing what mattered. His evenings became quieter, not empty, but intentional. He no longer felt the need to fill every moment with consumption, whether through shopping or endless scrolling. Instead, he allowed space to exist. And in that space he found something that had been missing for a long time. A sense of presence, the ability to sit, to reflect, to simply be without reaching for something to distract himself. His sleep improved without effort, not because he followed a new routine, but because his mind was no longer overloaded with unresolved inputs. And for the first time in years, he woke up without the weight of the previous day, carrying into the next. And as weeks turned into months, the changes extended beyond his immediate experience. His financial life simplified as well. Expenses naturally decreased because there was less desire to acquire, less impulse to fill imagined gaps. And what once required constant management now required very little attention. But perhaps the most significant shift was internal, because without the need to maintain a certain image, without the constant reinforcement of a constructed identity, he began to feel a different kind of stability, one that did not depend on external conditions, one that did not fluctuate with what he owned or how he was perceived. And in that stability there was a quiet confidence, not loud, not performative, but steady, the kind that comes from knowing that there is nothing unnecessary left to defend. He remembered a reflection from Marcus Aurelius, that if you seek tranquility, no less, or more accurately, do what is essential. And this idea no longer felt like philosophy. It felt like reality, because he had experienced it directly. He had seen how much of his previous effort had been spent maintaining things that did not contribute to his life, and how little was actually required for it to function well. And this did not make his life smaller. It made it clearer. The same apartment that once felt suffocating now felt open, not because its size had changed, but because the weight within it had been removed. And for the first time in a long time, he could move through his own space without resistance, without distraction, without the subtle tension that had once followed him everywhere. And this is what quiet transformation looks like. Not a new life, but the removal of everything that was preventing you from living the one you already had. At some point, after the noise fades and the space becomes clear, there is a truth that begins to surface, and it is not a comfortable one. It is the kind of truth that most people sense but choose not to look at directly, because once you see it, you cannot return to the same way of living. Tishi arrived at this realization not through theory, but through experience. By removing what was unnecessary, he was forced to confront why it had been there in the first place. And the answer was not practical, it was emotional. He did not accumulate because he needed more. He accumulated because he was avoiding something. And when he looked closely, every category of his possessions reflected a different form of avoidance. The items he bought impulsively were not about utility. They were attempts to fill a quiet emptiness that appeared when he was alone. The things he kept just in case were not about preparation. They were expressions of fear, a belief that without enough backup, something would go wrong. The objects tied to status were not about appreciation. They were efforts to secure validation, to confirm that he was moving in the right direction. And the items connected to past versions of himself were not about memory. They were anchors that prevented him from letting go. And once he saw this pattern, it became impossible to ignore. because the problem was no longer external, it was internal, and no amount of organizing or optimizing could resolve it. This is the truth that most people avoid, that what we own is often a reflection of what we have not resolved, and that accumulation is not just a habit. It is a strategy, a way of managing discomfort without addressing its source. And it works, but only temporarily, because the underlying tension remains, waiting for the next moment of stillness to surface again. Tishi understood now why the cycle never ended, why each purchase felt necessary in the moment, but empty shortly after. Why the desire to add never fully satisfied, because it was not driven by need. It was driven by absence, and absence cannot be filled by objects. It can only be faced, and this is where the difficulty lies, because facing it requires a kind of honesty that is not convenient. It requires sitting with questions that do not have immediate answers. It requires letting go of the idea that something external will eventually make everything feel complete, and instead accepting that clarity comes from within, not from what we bring into our lives, but from what we are willing to see without distraction. He remembered a line from Marcus Aurelius, that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts, and he realized that his thoughts had been shaped by everything around him, by the constant signals, the constant reminders, the constant pull of things that demanded attention. And once those were reduced, his thoughts began to change as well, not because he forced them to, but because there was finally space for them to settle. And in that settled state, he could see more clearly what mattered and what did not. And perhaps the most sobering realization was this, that eventually, everything we own will be left behind, whether we are ready or not, and that is not a distant concept. It is a certainty, one that gives weight to every decision we make about what we carry through life. Because if the end result is the same, if everything is eventually released, then the question becomes not how much we can accumulate, but how much we truly need in order to live well. And Tishi saw that he had spent years preparing for a future that never arrived, while overlooking the present that was always available. And now, with less, he had more of what he had been unconsciously searching for, not in objects, but in awareness, in presence, in the ability to move through his life without being pulled in 100 different directions. And this is the truth that remains. Simple, but not easy. That what you keep in your life should serve your clarity, not your avoidance. And anything that consistently pulls you away from yourself, no matter how useful it appears, deserves to be questioned. Because in the end, the cost of carrying what is unnecessary is not measured in space, but in the parts of your life that you slowly lose to it.